45 minutes, okay.
Good morning
Good afternoon.
to our friends in Southeast Asia. Good evening to our friends in the mainland United States. And good afternoon to everyone here in the room and in Honolulu. I'm Miriam Stark, and I'm the current director for the Center for Southeast Asian Studies at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. And it's my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Professor Patricio Jojo Abinales. He grew up in Ozami City on the northwestern side of the Philippine island of Mindanao and was one of those wunderkinds who graduated with a degree in history from the University of the Philippines-Diliman, or UP, and a Ph.D. in government and Southeast Asian studies from Cornell University. Jojo taught at the Department of Political Science at Ohio University from 1997 to 1999, before moving on to the Center for Southeast Asian Studies at Kyoto University in 2000. From 2010 to 2011, Jojo was a visiting scholar at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars in Washington, D.C., where he researched the political economy of U.S. economic assistance in Muslim Mindanao. In 2011, he joined the faculty of the Asian Studies program at UH-Manoa, and that's what he wants you to know because that's what's on the website. But I need you to know that he is a member of the UP Mafia and also the Cornell Mafia. Now, Jojo has been a very busy man in over 25 years or so. He's held visiting research scholar positions, both at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars and Cornell University. He's obtained research grants from 4 agencies, from the Rockefeller Archive Center to the Social Science Research Council. He's received 3 awards for his books since 2002. He's published 10 academic books, edited 8 academic books, and also 2 non-academic books, one in 2004 called Love, Sex, and the Filipino Communists in English. Jojo likes to write. He's contributed 27 chapters to edited volumes, 1 before completing his Ph.D., 26 journal articles, 6 before completing his Ph.D., and 38 book reviews, 3 before completing his Ph.D. He's done a lot I'm not talking to you about. He has a 27-page CV. He has also presented lectures and contributed to 105 conferences and workshops where he has frequently been featured as either a discussant or a keynote speaker. Jojo is a teacher. He's taught as a teaching assistant, instructor, lecturer, professor at 7 different institutions. I've named some of them, but at UP, he was in 2 programs, I believe. At Cornell, he was in 3 programs, Ohio University at Political Science, at Kobe University, Kyoto University, and Hitotsubashi University in different programs. And we've had him here sometimes when we can get hold of him since 2011. He served on PhD dissertation committees as an outside reviewer for 2 Australian universities, a resource person on the Philippines and consultant to the US State Department for multiple news outlets and on many editorial and advisory board boards for journals and books. He's currently working on a book which is tentatively entitled Fraternities, Violence, and the Making of a Filipino Elite about the University of the Philippines. And next up will be a book he's tentatively entitled Everyday Authoritarianism, the University of the Philippines under Martial Law, which he will pursue through a visiting scholar position at Kyoto University from March through August 2025. You may find it as amusing as I do that he also plans to live on or near the University of Philippines campus as he's completing these 2 books about its secret underbelly. Summarizing all these years of Jojo Abinales' work is really impossible in such a brief introduction. We have been extremely fortunate to have him here with us for nearly 13 years as a scholar, as a teacher, and as a public intellectual. And for many of us, we have also been very lucky to have him here as a friend. It is with great pleasure, even as I am feeling very sorry for all of us that Jojo will leave us soon, that I introduce Dr. Patricio Abinales this afternoon to talk with us about what's wrong with Philippine Studies, with a Q&A that I will help moderate after his talk. Please join me in welcoming Jojo this afternoon.
I feel like Nikolai Bukharin before he being shot by Stalin. He did some audio work, but then he did this stuff. I tend to be disorganized if I talk without a paper, so you'll have to forgive me that I have to read some of them. So before anything else, I would like to thank the Center for Southeast Asian Studies and its fearless leader, Miriam Stark, for extending me this invitation and organizing it. And I also would like to thank my colleagues at the Department of Asian Studies, our equally fearless leader, Kathy Clayton, Anastir Parbrandaya, and the staff for making the 11 years I've been here so fun and fruitful. And I will carry back the wonderful memories I've had here home while I figure out my future, and that includes learning how to walk two dogs. Now, this lecture is part of a larger project I've been working off and on for several years now, and this is an examination of the state of the social sciences in post-war Philippines. Now, today's talk tracks the rightward drift of nationalist history in the country, how this was explained by historians themselves, and how it would affect efforts to bring in local and marginal stories into the national narrative, not stories of communities like Muslims and women. I set this aside again, parenting, work, etc., for a while, but began to get interested in it after reading a piece by one of the country's what perceived progressive historians. So, in his essay on the Philippine presidential campaign, published on May 6, 2022, by the University of Melbourne website Asia Links, historian Reynaldo Elto described the team of Ferdinand Bongbong Marcos and Davao City Mayor Sara Duterte, predicted that the team would win, quote, judging by the polls and the massive turnouts in BBM, that's Bongbong, Sara rallies and motorcades. He added that this unusual turn of popularity of the son of the dictator Marcos and the daughter of the notorious President Rodrigo Duterte reflected something, quote, deeper in what is going on beneath the surface, which he says in turn, quote, is the outcome of an ongoing clash of political narratives over the past 50 years. He added, and I quoted there, in recent decades, the dominant narrative of a dark age of dictatorship under Marcos has been eroded by the uncovering of new information about what had happened in the 1970s and 1980s. First, as the US moved towards globalism, Marcos insisted upon following a nationalist trajectory of development, prioritizing industrialization and self-sufficiency in food and energy. Marcos's independent foreign policy displeased the American imperialists, and there is overwhelming evidence that his removal was directed from Washington. Not true. Ileto did not stop there. He credited social media for providing, quote, alternative readings of the narrative of Marcos's rule, and he shared the suspicions of Marcos loyalists as to, quote, whether the elder Marcos had looted the treasury or, as claimed by the family, possessed wealth of his own even before he became president. He reminded readers that, quote, numerous cases of plunder against the Marcoses had not prospered for lack of evidence, quote, unquote. He blamed post-Marcos regimes for showing, quote, no urgency in discovering the truth. Moreover, President Corazon Aquino, who succeeded Marcos, was not able to respond well to, quote, post-people power expectations of an age of prosperity, for under her regime, the country's, quote, energy and food security, peace and order, and industrial development declined. In short, in the eyes of Ileto, democratic reform did not lead to a better life for the average Filipinos. He closed his essay with Rodrigo Duterte. The latter's decision to allow the carcass of the Marcos Sr. to be moved to the Cemetery of Heroes had, quote, served to heighten public consciousness of an alternative history of the Marcos years that had been swept under the rug by the democracy narrative of the 1986 People Power Uprising. His pro-China policy, quote, was the natural offshoot attempt of Duterte to push back on the immense influence that the U.S. has had on foreign policy making, particularly under the previous governments. Duterte's criticism of America, Ileto contends, was rooted in his knowledge of the forgotten Filipino-American War of 1892 to 1902, where the United States, quote, had come to the Philippines as an aggressor that committed atrocities against both Christians and Muslim Filipinos who resisted the American takeover, and it also destroyed the First Republic founded in 1898. But Duterte, according to him, quote, had to retreat somewhat from his ambitious goal of an independent foreign policy due to pressure by the military and pro-Americans in his cabinet. However, this did not remove, quote, the fear among supporters of Bongbong and Sara and the Duterte government itself that something unexpected might happen that will derail the present course of events. Okay. Now, what this 180-degree turn from a progressive to a conservative among historians is nothing new. See, for example, the case of Elizabeth and Eugene Genovese. No? Ileto turning his back on democratic and popular politics and embracing Duterte and Marcos, however, cannot be just labeled as an individual's political regression. I would suggest that this was more the consequence of the triumph of a state-centered intellectual current that argues that the Philippines' problem with the so-called unfinished revolution has been resolved. I'm sorry, there's no jokes here, so there you go. Okay. Now, the Filipinos launched the first nationalist revolution in Asia, almost defeating the Spanish colonialists, and then only to be aborted, quote unquote, as historian Flora Kiboin puts it, by the Americans. The United States eventually granted the Philippines its independence in 1946, but retained firm neo-colonial control over the former colony. So the goals of the 1896 revolution for complete independence remain unfulfilled, so as long as Americans and the United States domination persist. So this became the mantra of post-war writings and declarations on Philippine history, with several claiming to be its main advocates, starting with leaders of the state. There was Manuel L. Quezon and his effusive admiration of Andres Bonifacio, the leader of the first uprising, and of Jose Rizal, our national hero, whom Quezon called the creator of Filipino nationality. Quezon became president of the Commonwealth, which he regarded as the transition to full independence. For Quezon, this independence could only be achieved once this independence is achieved. The goals of the revolution would be fulfilled. Diosdado Macapagal, the Republic's 9th president, the one on your left, was the first to use the term having come face to face, according to Ileto, with, quote, the exploitative inconsistencies of foreign domination and influence in our country. But the most ideological of them all was Ferdinand Marcos. When he declared martial law in September 20, 1972, Marcos justified his coup as the first step in accomplishing what he called the democratic revolution from the center that will eradicate Filipinos' inherited colonial vices via a state-centered revolution that was peaceful, liberal, and not of the Jacobin type. This revolution, according to Marcos, is the continuation of the one in 1890, but this time it would make sure that it will not fall into factional rivalries, corruption, and even racial deficiencies that damaged the first one. So for Marcos, the democratic revolution was the, quote, necessity of the present, even as he sought to examine the past. After Marcos, there was the left. The torch of the 1896 revolution was carried on by the Socialist Party of the Philippines, the one below, by millenarian groups, the one above, which associated their struggles for the quest for divine salvation with the fulfillment of independence. I was telling Jonathan, Ben, and Ihito this afternoon that, you know, among this millenarian movement, they're waiting for Jose Rizal and Jesus Christ to come, and once they come, the Philippines will be liberated. And there was the Communist Party of the Philippines, whose, quote, national democratic revolution of a new type was a continuation and a transcendence of the 1896 national revolution of the old type. Okay. But it was in the academic Teodoro Agoncillo, however, who gave substance to the idea of this unfinished revolution in his book published in 1956 called The Revolt of the Masses, the Story of Andres Bonifacio and Katipunan. Agoncillo discussed the class divide inside the 1896 revolution, leading to the death of Bonifacio under the hands of his rivals who belonged to, quote, the middle class. And from there, the revolution took a deep dive, and even Bonifacio's successors were able to install the First Republic, but it was short-lived because the same elite leaders continued their betrayal of the spirit of 1896 by changing sides and joining the Americans. Now, by the 1960s, however, A group of young nationalists and radicals would refer to the book, The Revolt of the Masses, as one of their earliest guides to understanding the class struggle of the Filipino people. The result was the publication of the Communist Party's founding chairman, Jose Maria Sison's Philippine Society and Revolution, the so-called Bible of today's revolutionaries. PSR was a near copycat of the Indonesian Communist Party's DNIDET's 1957 work, Indonesian Society and Indonesian Revolution, and like the latter, sought to insert communism into an existing nationalist framework. Now, these interpretations of the unfinished revolution share the same sentiment toward the US, but differed on the appropriate response to its presence and power. Quezon and Marcos worked with the imperialists, quote unquote, but sought to undermine them, while the Communist Party advocated an armed revolution against, quote, US imperialism and its, quote, puppet regimes. Now, in the late 1960s, both were engaged in a political and ideological war against each other, with the radicals gaining the initiative against an increasingly unpopular Marcos, whose regime was riddled with corruption, maladministration, and mismanagement. Marcos, however, had a constitutional provision in his favor, warning of a left-right conspiracy to seize power and the threat of a Muslim rebellion for the independence of Mindanao. Marcos declared martial law on September 21, arrested about 30,000 people, from elite politicians to infamous gangsters to student radicals, and announced that henceforth he would rule the country under constitutional authoritarianism. So there's no just pictures to get you so you won't get bored. So martial law resolved which of the interpretations of the unfinished revolution would prevail, of course. So from that 74 onward, the Democratic Revolution from the Center, small textbook, was the only one available to the public. Agoncillo retired, we were his last student, citing the need for historian, but also when asked why he didn't write about martial law, he said, well, we need to maintain temporal distance from current events. So he refused to add chapters on the late 60s and the earlier years of the Marcos dictatorship in his textbook, a popular text and required textbook, History of the Filipino People. His silence, however, was offset by Renato Constantino, who wrote The Philippines, a Past Revisited in 1975, note the dates, in a second volume, The Philippines, a Continuing Past in 1978, which he co-wrote with his wife, Leticia. Now, in these two volumes, Constantino built on Agoncillo's arguments and write about Filipino nationalism's twists and turns and the socialist and Marxist slants of post-war people's movements during the late American period and the era of the Republic. The Constantino's books could have filled the gap that the CPP could not, for obvious reasons. They went underground, but they chose not to, aware that the dictatorship only tolerated, quote, their progressive writings as long as this steered clear from contemporary events or linking Marcos to the American imperialists, quote unquote. I was his research assistant, and that was the only thing I'm not supposed to research on. Nothing on the Marcoses. So we started mainly in the 50s. Now, meanwhile, to strengthen the legitimacy of his democratic revolution from the center, Marcos set to rewrite Philippine history. The product was Tadhana, the history of the Filipino people, a multi-volume project that would show the continuity between the pre-colonial archipelago and the authoritarian present. Marcos was supposed to be official author of the books, but the real writers were historians, many of them my professors from the University of the Philippines, some of them former radicals who made peace with the dictatorship. Manny also was included. These scholars sought to diminish the radical influence of Philippine Studies and also reinforce its conservative side. Unfortunately, or fortunately, the product only produced 2 volumes, the project. Unless all this covered the Spanish era. In the published volumes, Marcos portrayed the archipelago as a place thriving of indigenous cultures that, because of their connections to the Southeast Asian region and beyond, were also cosmopolitan. Spanish colonialism sought to end this and disconnect the Philippines from Asia, and although they tried to do so, the Spanish inadvertently also laid the groundwork for the evolution of a Filipino national identity as expressed to the writings of Jose Rizal and the actions of Andres Bonifacios. Marcos's ghost historians were never able to explore these arguments when their collaboration devolved into factional battles. But Tadhana actually spawned one of the most important theoretical developments in the writing of Philippine history. Pantayong Pananaw, Our Perspective, or PP, pushed for a historical philosophy, historiography, methodology, and perspective that privileges the Filipino point of view as it is expressed and written in the national language Filipino. Its founder, Zio Salazar, one of the Tadhana historians, argued that the pursuit for a bagong kasaysayan and new history had been hindered by elitists and outsiders who spoke in English. The real culprits, in the eyes of Salazar, were American historians and Filipinos like me who were trained abroad and returned home to promote this imperialist viewpoint in the research and their teachings. So Pantayong Pananaw's prime mission was to challenge this pro-Western view by promoting a sense of we-ness, Pantayo, Filipino, and pursuing Filipino as the mode of discourse and teaching so as to upend the imperialist pervasive effects on the mind of Filipinos. The theory animated a large group of young historians who started the reading with Agoncillo, Constantino, and Sison. But it also constrained their curiosity by its dogmatic insistence that there now existed a Filipino nation, and its sole lingua franca is Filipino. These advocates, in particular, refused to recognize the contributions of what the young historian Lisandro Claudio calls, quote, the various works on Philippine historiography that are non-nationalist. Claudio adds, since the 1970s, non-Manila-centered historians have exposed the limits of, quote, national history, which clothe the divergent histories of various localities. These works establish that local histories may not only diverge from linear narrative developments about the nation as a whole, but can even contradict these narratives. There has also been critical work examining how the nation has been imagined and reimagined at specific historical periods, revealing the concept's contingency. Now, while critical of alleged elite and intellectual sellout to the westernized viewpoint, PP also played down class and ethnic struggles, arguing that partly because they were often led by westernized and English-speaking academics, it was hard to understand their popular and class appeals. This cultural baggage also would explain their fall. Now, what about the radicals? Well, the Communist Party of the Philippines was battered by martial law and to reorient the revolution to address a more restrictive, more polarized, and expanded nation and politics, and started to expand nationwide. PSR, Season's book, remained the prime political educational text, but this time complemented by long essays on the U.S. Marcos dictatorship. However, having forced underground, the effectiveness of the reach of this radical class-based interpretation of Philippine history had been limited, and the Communist Party ceded the nationalist argument to Constantino. So the unfinished revolution, as interpreted by the left, remains well unfinished. Okay? This is not to say that there were no other pro-people narratives. In 1979, just when the Marcos dictatorship was beginning to show signs of weakening and the Communist Party achieving a national presence for the first time in Philippine history, Ileto published the famous Pon and Revolution. Now, in the introduction of his first edition, he said, Passion was his contribution to the struggle against the Marcos dictatorship. The book was highly praised for explaining the people's uncanny ability to reformat religious tracts and turn them into nationalist revolutionary codes. American rule and its ideological apparatuses, like the public school systems, failed to erase its millenarian sentiment. And in a later piece, Ileto even extends this millenarian argument to describe the politics of urban classes, especially what happened in 1986 with the downfall of Marcos. Yet one actually cannot ignore the presence of a conservative kernel in this famous work. So while messianic undertones were pervasive in many peasant uprisings, Passion also underestimated the peasants' capacity for understanding and appreciating secular and socialist ideologies. For example, The rural origins of the Partido Socialista ng Pilipinas at the turn of the 20th century and the presence of peasant cadres, first in Marxist-Leninism inside the first Communist Party, the Partido Comunista ng Pilipinas, all point to rural communities welcoming secular ideologies. As the Filipino Marxist academic Francisco Munamenso noted, these movements, socialist and religious ideas seamlessly intertwined with each other. I personally, Ben's book is an interesting work to look at this intertwining, but I also personally encountered two Hook leaders who explained to me over beers in detail how, to us academics over beer, why Marx was critical of Hegel, he could not pronounce H because he was from Central Philippines, and Feuerbach, whom he called Powderback. Yeah. And why Stalin's clunky dialectical and historical materialism was a handy abridged version of Marxism. These were two peasants. Okay? Now, even theology had welcomed Marxism at the time of the Passion's appearance. Edicio de la Torre, a young cleric who would eventually join the Communist Party, produced the first Filipino essay on the theology of liberation after Vatican II. He explored the commonalities of Maoism and religion and blending them into a justification for priests, nuns, ministers, and laity to join the revolution. A decade later, the Communist Party's largest regional organization in the South, the Mindanao Commission, attributed its remarkable expansion not to Maoism as an ideology, but to the theology of liberation. Okay, so these were reactions to religious reactions to Passion. Then after he finished his Ph.D. history at Cornell, Ileto went up to the Philippines to join the Tadhana project and came across Salazar. The basis for a future camaraderie was laid down in that project. These two threads, one that grew out of the Marcosian ideology and the other an attempt to superimpose theology over Marxism, would eventually break bread, with Ileto writing the piece Orientalism and the Study of Philippine Politics, where he criticized prominent American scholars in the Philippines for what he called their Orientalism. He was particularly scathing of the works of Alfred W. McCoy, John Seidel, and Benedict Anderson, for the alleged mischaracterization of local elites as caciques, warlords, or spoilsmen, when they were, Ileto argued, in fact, patriots and legatees of the 1896 revolution, and therefore hence played a big role in the shaping of the nation. He would include in an anthology an essay that put together further his alleged anti-Orientalist attack. The Filipino historian was appalled by what he saw as, quote, a glaring omission that emerges from the collection, adding, Ambeto Ramos says, there is no essay on how he, Ileto, developed from criticism how he really actually honored by this, and how he was actually honored by his detractors. Friendly praise is never the same or as affirmative as unfair criticism from the enemy. Now, like Pantayong Pananaw, Orientalism texts ignore the fact that these three characters, McCoy, Anderson, and Seidel, were passionate critics of the Marcos dictatorship. Anderson refused to return to the Philippines while Marcos was in power and did not hide his disgust of the dictatorship. McCoy exposed the sugar barons in the central Philippines and the way they oppressed peasants. He also criticized the dictatorship's handling of the religious leaders, religious clergy who supported his peasants. And finally, he exposed Marcos's fake medals at the last years of the dictator's power. While Seidel was not overtly political, his work on both Filipino bosses, warlords, and strongmen exposed how local politics plays out, especially in terms of its autocratic and violent nature. But their being white, an American appeared enough to delegitimize their politics. Now, I'm almost done. Now, this slide to reactionary politics reached its nadir in recent years. Ileto was enthusiastically welcomed the presidency of Rodrigo Duterte for his anti-American position, as I said earlier, and his more nuanced as a local leader. He said nothing about Duterte's brutality, nor the fact that the mayor acted more like a strongman interested in spoils in Davao City and power than the principal municipal captain that Ileto describes in his article. Then in 2020, of course, he wholly adopted the Marcusian argument, a position that drew the praise of pro-Marcos intellectuals. Salazar, retired or ejected from the University of the Philippines, depending on how you interpret it, published the first volume of his A Socio-Political Cultural Biography of Joseph Ejercito Estrada, the drug president who was overthrown in 2000, which focused on the, quote, success and challenges faced by the Estrada administration and the events leading to the former president's ouster in January 2001. We know little of its publishers, the RPG Foundation. I was trying to look at it and I thought it was some bazooka or, there's no such thing as a RPG Foundation. Now, there's a copy of the book in the University of Philippines National College of Public Administration Library, which added a caveat that says the book is out of print. Now, when he was repeatedly criticized for his refusal to recognize the armed rebellion of the Moro National Liberation Front in 1905, Salazar finally admitted, quote, I am on the side of forming the nation, whether this be done by Marcos, Estrada, or even Benigno Aquino III. I am your enemy, and I'm the one who has the right to judge you in the name of the nation. Now, this reactionary turn in Philippine history has become more and more confident in its stance. The ghost of Marcos and the doddering, ruthless Duterte could never be happier. Thank you. I have a last line, but that's okay.
You have more?
Yeah, more, but
No, keep going.
Huh?
Yeah.
How many minutes? They might be bored.
They're not bored.
They're not bored?
We'll do Q&A afterwards.
Okay. So I have coming back to the patience. Okay, now because the abstract that says I talk about marginal communities. I mentioned this to Barbara and Leonard when we were in Tawi-Tawi. Now, my last question is, how would all this relate to the attempt to integrate local histories of marginalized communities in the nation state? To best illustrate this, let me close this talk by asking you to imagine meeting a Muslim woman, last name is Tan, okay, sitting in her hut in Panglima, Gusugala, which is an islet in Tawi-Tawi, Dalawaran, sorting out knock-off iPhones from southern China, malong from Indonesia, 5-in-1 coffee sachets from Malaysia, Vietnamese cookies, Chinese sausages from Xiamen, Singaporean candies, copies of the digitized 2020 version of the famous 1972 Japanese porn Ichiju Sweat Blast, and bullets for assault rifles. Now, Baitan is doing this while watching reruns of our favorite Indonesian drama series, so in the south, okay, Love in Paris, Indonesians would know this, featuring the hunk Dimas Anggara on a rewired Japanese-made TV she bought cheaply from a Filipino crew member of a Panamanian-owned cargo ship passing the Sulu Sea. Occasionally, she would glance at her cell phone, expecting a text from her Saudi-based daughter, overseas Filipino worker daughter, who will tell her how much will be remitted to the bank in the capital of Tawi-Tawi, Bungao, the provincial capital. She hopes to get the text before 1 p.m. because the currents will shift past the time. If she takes her motorized bangka after 1 p.m., she will likely end up in Bukaan, Gorontalo province, northern Sulawesi. So here is the dilemma of that historians in the Metropolitan Center will have to face. Here we have a citizen and a felon. Okay. A Filipino with a resident certificate holder, with a resident certificate, but whose mental world is global. Yeah? Northern Sulawesi, Xiamen, Singapore, Sumatra, Kuala Lumpur, and Sandakan. She is Muslim, but comfortable with marketing the most un-Islamic of goods. Ichiju Sweat Blast, bullets. Okay? She lives at the edge of the national territory. Panglima Gusugala is an islet near Tawi-Tawi, where we were there a month ago. In the site in the Sulu zone where state leaders and Filipino scholars regard with trepidation because it is where political disorder is at its most intense, allegedly, and the national state is at its weakest. Okay. She is Muslim and Chinese, Tan, the spawn of two minority groups that people in Manila mistrust these days. The late national artist F. Chanel Jose turned racist in his dying days and accused Chinese Filipinos of being China's fifth column, while the 2004 survey of the Philippine Human Development Report showed that 48% of Filipinos still believe that Muslims are terrorists and would run amok. So what would Philippine history look like if written from the state center perspective? Or alternately, what would Philippine history look like if Baitan starts to write it? The portrait that will be painted is one of detachment. Moros even today do not consider themselves Filipinos. Oppression is one detachment of oppression, physical and cultural, by the Philippine state, especially under the Marcos dictatorship, and displacement as settlers from the northern Philippines, aided by the Philippine state, intrude into Muslim lands and take over local politics. And these are stories that can never be accommodated into today's historical orthodoxy because they threaten the unity of the nation, the Bayan. Thank you. Sorry, I thought I overslept. Thank you.
Well, thanks very much. So I guess my job is to moderate. And as I wait for the questions that I can see are coming in from our virtual audience, we can ask first if anyone here would like to start it off. I'm going to start with Professor Andaya. Speak loudly, please.
Yes, it's a very interesting talk, mainly because I agree with everything you say. And just looking at your presentation seems very much an elite presentation versus the actuality. You know what we were talking about in Tawi-Tawi?
Yeah.
That, the rest of the area is exactly that. So, what you are looking at from here, from my point of view, is this elite group talking about we Filipinos, and who are they actually referring to, right?
Yeah.
Whereas we Filipinos, from the way back before the nation state, did have the kind of viewpoint of Tan, because they had so many intricate relationships with the people around the region.
Yeah.
And that's what's missing in here. And that's why I thought your presentation was brilliant, because it showed so much of it as a kind of an elitist discussion, totally dominated by scholars. This is an elitist viewpoint, a nationalist viewpoint that is dominated by nationalist history.
Yeah, so it's actually interesting on how when you tell Muslims about this, there's not, yeah, you're right. It's more, damn it, why did why are we not in the narrative? What's happening here? And I think my theory is the more the illicit economy, which is 30% already of the economy, expands, the more nationalist history will disappear. Because other groups will start to write their own stories, and
Sorry, we had a question here.
Yeah. I just want to have a simple question, because this is like a recurring theme that I find in Philippine studies. Why there is tension between the home scholar or home trained scholar and those from foreign scholar or Western trained scholar in the Philippine studies? Because if I'm not mistaken, Seidel was answering Reynaldo Elto articles.
I think if you look at some of the writings of Philippine scholars, including Professor Kirkby, there is a questioning of how the national story is taught. Folks are not, communists are not included, Muslims are not included. The interesting thing about Filipino Western scholars who began researching the Philippines in the 70s and 80s is they went local. Manila his politics is so boring. So you go center, you go south. So some of the most productive scholarships on local politics, local histories in the Philippines, Muslim, come from Western scholars, and that's the irony of it all. National Philippine scholars, however, are still a product of this unfinished revolution, which is now assumed like a linguistic twist, which is if you don't write in Filipino, then you cannot write the national history. Blah, how about maybe science? We don't speak Tagalog. Yeah. So I think that's the interesting that has happened in the 70s and the 80s and the 90s. And I think will continue to do so when Indonesian scholars like you will study Sulawesi and Davao, and therefore undermine Jakarta and Manila.
Anna.
Yeah, how influential is the elite narrative at the local level? I mean, you've laid it out beautifully. Is this what is spoken on TV? Is this what is primarily circulated in social media?
Yes, because it's the required textbook.
Yeah, that's what I was wondering. And in different historical shifts, political shifts, do you see a difference in textbook publishing? Or just academic publishing, where anything that talks about, I don't know, diversity is no longer on the table to be published. Do you see that happening?
There's two kinds of academic textbooks. The ones that are done by people commissioned by the Department of Education, wherein if you produce whatever textbook you have in the Philippine history, and I think your net revenue is as an author is 11 million pesos a year. So you can write that and you get, and there are the academic textbooks that are coming from the University of the Philippines, Ateneo, and these are more, more academic, more scholarship and all that, but extremely limited in terms of reach. I think any book in the Philippines that has come out first, only 500 copies would be produced. If those 500 copies are sold, then you go reprint. So the struggle then at the secondary and elementary level, even the one that loses already are the academics, because a lot of the people writing these textbooks for private public schools and the private schools, as per the decree of the Department of Education, are not academics from these prime universities, and it's really a very profitable business. I was involved in one, but yeah. So that's the problem now. That's another complication to this fight over the narrative.
Kathy.
Oh my God.
Thanks for that crash course in Philippine history and politics. I didn't know about it. So what strikes me is that certain elements of this story sound kind of familiar, both to what's going on in the U.S., what's going on in China, like certain ways that nationalist narratives are being revived to exclude, alternate narratives of who we are. And so is there something that we're going through in this moment as sort of a planet that is sort of prompting these kinds of reworkings, or how do you see this, do you see connections or relations to other contexts where similar kinds of retellings of history of the revolution and unfinished work is going on?
I think in the Philippine case, at least, and this is the second part of this study, which is there are two structural factors, I think, that have influences. First is the normalization of Philippine politics. But by Philippine politics, here we mean the politics of families, political dynasties, warlords. Never in the history since '86 has the Philippines been normal and stable. It's become like Thailand. The second one is, I think, has something to do with the fact that because of this, one of the outcomes of this is the neutralization and the weakening of the left. So the radical criticism of Philippine history, or the writing of Philippine history, which was very instrumental in the 60s, led to the writings on nationalism by the people like Constantino. You have the radical pressure from below that demands, that would challenge and demand a rewriting. That's absent too. The left in the Philippines is practically destroyed. There is no other. The other, yeah, those are the two factors, I think. And the third thing, of course, is regional politics that's going on, US, China, we Filipinos and all that. The Chinese are coming, it's bomb them. This kind of regional tensions is abetting this kind of sentiment that say, okay, let's pepper down our differences, past and present, and let's get ready to fight the Chinese. So I think these are three factors. And then, of course, the fact that the production of textbook is a very highly corrupt affair. Profitable, better.
Mina.
Thank you, Jojo. I told my friends you're giving your last lecture at UH, but so I have two questions. So first is this idea of this reactionary turn that you're talking about. So is it a reaction from? I mean, what you're saying is that the reaction to a leftist nationalist historiography and moving to a more kind of authoritarian, embrace of authoritarian values, which personally I don't really see in the Philippines, right? I mean, there's, especially in the academe, right? We have so many people who are very much against authoritarianism and rights against authoritarianism and all that, right? So I don't know what exactly is the reactionary turn, whether, I mean, maybe, and as far as I know, PP, I mean, there's probably only one VP person in UP left, right?
Let me in LaSalle.
Oh, okay. But anyway, and I don't know whether PP is actually, you would consider as reactionary to, to the nationalist historiography. It is a reaction for sure, but and maybe there are some nativist authoritarian tendencies to that, but a lot of people will disagree that this is a kind of embrace of authoritarian values, right? So that's my first question. Maybe you should answer that. And Miriam, I want my second question to after that.
Yeah, you got it.
I think if you listen to discourse in the Philippines now, there are two important threads. One is let's rethink the Marcos era. There was something good there. And I'm not just saying pro-Marcos sentiment. I'm talking of scholars, public intellectuals. That maybe we missed something there. There was something that Marcos. The second one is if we emphasize these marginal communities, the stories as marginal communities, we can't fit them into the nation. Muslims, they're not Filipinos. The one thing I'm actually exploring is the absence of women, in this national history. There's no women. Because if you bring in women, I think it cannot challenge that nation, the idea of the nation. But that's the second thing. The third thing I think is it's easier now for somebody to say that the Marcos era was the golden years and we should go back to it, not only in terms of studying the economy, but intellectually, because the new generation has no memory at all of the Marcos dictatorship. It's like us and World War II. And so there is now this ripe environment to reshape the thinking of people. And I think that continues to be strong now. I mean, university, there's no conference that studies Duterte or Marcos in the same way as, the radicals in the 60s and 70s did. The trend really is to say that those were the golden years. Or if they were not the golden years, he did something good. And the sad thing really is people like Ileto are supporting that. And how much he's respected in Philippine scholarship. Gave the talk last 2 weeks ago in the international conference. So I think that's the one that's really scary, and all the more reason for me to go home because I'm gonna fight gonna do battle with this fantastic fascist. Yeah.
Mina wants number two.
Okay, I have my second. So yes, I agree with some, I mean, all the people that you're talking about are probably the most, the most common people that we could attack in Philippine historiography now, right? But I think I was hoping that you'll end your talk in your last lecture with talking about what's right in Philippine studies.
What?
What's right?
That's your talk, not mine.
But actually, that's what Philip Michael Pache also asked.
Because I mean, I was just, we've just been there. I was in that conference, And I think you're undermining even your own work. I mean, you have incorporated the story of Mindanao in our historiography.
No, it hasn't been cited in national histories.
Okay, it's not in those textbooks, but it has. Everybody knows your work about Mindanao's story and women. There's a lot of people who have incorporated stories of women. Maybe they're not in the textbook. And those textbooks, which are, most people even think they're outdated, right? Whatever. You know, it's I mean, you're right. People still buy it and it's still considered as canon. But as I see it, like going to the conferences and I mean, there's a lot of things that are right in Philippine studies. And, like the push for local and regional histories has never been stronger. There are a lot more female historians, Before, you can really count the female historians in UP, and now there's a lot more them and talking about women and gender. And there's a lot of people who are working on indigenous narratives and indigenous stories. I mean, there's in fact, when you look at the UP department, maybe everyone's probably really, like very young during the Marcos, period. So it's true. It's like a changing of a generation, right? But I just feel like there's a lot of really new work that's very exciting in Philippine studies, and there's a lot of things that are right about it.
Well, apart from it, you should
right.
do that.
Okay, I will do that as my last.
Yeah, you're right. There's a lot of rich writings going on, but the giants of Filipino historiography are still dominated by these conservatives. Unless you topple those giants in, those young people will never.
But they're actually gone in UP, right?
Huh? Yeah, but they're not the giants. Salazar, Ileto, Constantinos are dead, so are still, Yes.
Wait,
wait. Ito?
Yeah, so I really enjoyed talking and learned a lot. And I was thinking about how, the study of Philippine history and the nationalist take comes also in the context of independence and after independence, so national movements. And then, like in the Indonesian context, you also see sort of like places that break away. You see like East Timor, for example, becoming an independent state, and then they start to write their own national histories as well, right? So I'm just kind of curious, when you look at Mindanao, where you've done your research, is there kind of a reproduction of its own sort of nationalist discourse, or is it sort of an alternative way in which you think history? How has that process gone?
Well, Bina is right. The younger scholars, I'm just probably generalizing, but there are a bunch of younger scholars, especially Filipinos who studied in universities but studied the local histories, like Patricio Dacudao, who wrote about Davao, who are now trying to make this argument similar to Jim Warren. Looks at places in the Philippines that are not necessarily connected to Manila, but to a more global network. So Davao, a frontier, supposedly a backwater of the Philippine state, according to Dacudao, said, well, no, it was imagined as the last point of the western frontier. Americans visited it and looked at it as a part of the American frontier story. I mean, it's cosmopolitan. The other interesting thing that Dacudao mentioned is that if you look at the connections between Davao and the other, it has closer connections to Japan. 18,000 Japanese working in hemp plantation, and therefore the thinking of a lot of people in Davao is not Manila; it's Tokyo, California, and to a certain extent, in the Muslim side, Sabah, Singapore. And so what these young people are discovering now is that you don't have to write a history that is necessarily always connected to the Philippine state, to the Manila. You can actually write a regional history. It's actually like Oliver Wolters resurrected. Yeah, its island, its point is a center of its own. And I think the Wolters in Philippine historiography is Warren. I think the farther you are from the center, the more interesting your works are. And that's what we encountered in Tawi-Tawi. But, it hasn't been part of the national narrative. You name me a syllabus on Philippine history that includes these regions? None.
One more from Anna, then we have a lot of questions coming in.
My question is so badly formulated. I'll try to do a good job. How does this speak to the global left? I mean, you were saying the left is dead, but looking at other places that I know more about, namely Nepal and China, this kind of nationalist narrative at the expense of multiple minority groups within the state has been the province of the left. Like, there are many different lefts, but currently the ruling one in Nepal is saying, no, yeah, we acknowledge all of those things, but subsume it into nationalism. Nationalism is more important, and same in China. And so you're saying it's backwards in the Philippines to that.
It's weak.
If I understand it better, like these people who are saying subsume everything into the nation are the reactionaries. Is that right? If you had a leftist resurgence, then it would be more incorporating these international people, like the ethnographic example you gave.
Well, the only left-wing history textbook that I think was Season's Philippine Society and Revolution. Nothing has been written after that in terms of Constantino does anti-Americanism, but really rarely looks at local politics.
What about yours?
Me? I'm an anarchist. No, but actually, the direction of my research is that, which is, if you take out Manila as a factor in the writing of history, what would that history look like? If you think about the smuggler by Tan, and ask her how would she write about history, her encounters with national states, with Filipinos, how would she write it? And that's what I'm more interested in. The complicating factor of writing a left-wing history in the Philippines is defeat. The left was defeated in 1986. And most of those who were, and members of the left, the intellectuals usually, have not written their stories yet. When there's a factor of trauma, you were defeated, you were tortured, etc. The victory that you anticipated never happened. You have to go through this trauma. It's only now, for example, that I'm getting this request from people to say, can you read my memoir? The people are just starting to write now. So we'll take another probably 10 years for a left-wing a renaissance of the left analysis of Philippine politics to happen, because the main concern really is, where did we go wrong? The left. How did we do that? How did we overcome this? And it's not being spurred by an intellectual demand. It's spurred by their grandchildren saying, why am I called Karl Marx Santos, for heaven's sake? Where were you 15 years ago? So these are all very personal responses. I think it'll take another 10 years before somebody looks at the bigger picture.
Could I just recognize that a lot of people have been submitting questions online. So thanks to all of them. I'm going to jump into one from Nasri Barawi because it seems like it might be related. Nasri Barawi says, thank you for your interesting talk. How has decolonization or decolonial scholarship figured in Philippine studies? Has it been used by elite scholars to promote their versions of nationalist histories? And yes, I kept thinking about Zeus Salazar and that he would consider himself a decolonial scholar at the same time as he was promoting a history of the metropole.
Yeah, and Muslims would say the problem, the colonizing process involves us doing away with Filipino colonialism. It's not Americans. So decolonialization here, if applied to the Philippine case, must have its own local version.
Yeah.
When Muslims, up to now, some of them say we're not Filipinos. And how do you account for that? So decolonization here involves that. I would also, and this is something I want to cover, the decolonization process in the Philippines also involves putting up women at the center of the conversation. And there are some puzzling things here, because, how do you explain Corazon Aquino, the wife of the Moro National Liberation Front chairman, Disbinomonda Maswari, the mistress of Fidel Ramos, the Gloria Arroyo, yes, and Imelda Marcos? Yeah. They can't be. How are they being? Are they not being fit? They're not put. They're not made to fit in a national story. But these are women who are powerful women, you know. So decolonization process is both gendered but also minority in the Philippines. So I don't think the ideas as developed by scholars in the West would necessarily apply back home.
Except that when scholars in the West, forgive me, I'm an archaeologist, but my understanding of decolonizing Philippine studies would involve privileging local histories and also looking outside of the center. That's why it's so interesting, because when Salazar in the 80s was talking about it, he thought of decolonizing Philippine history as taking away outsiders. But that's a very different view, because you're saying that at the same time he was focused so much on the center and on elite histories.
Or as I responded to Stephen Acabado, your student in Tawi-Tawi, talking about decolonization, I said, why don't we just abolish the nation state?
No.
Why don't we start imagining abolishing the nation state? He didn't answer though.
I imagine. But Michael Montesano has a related question. Jojo, you stress the need to incorporate people in the margins of Philippine territory into Philippine history. What are your thoughts about the incorporation of Filipinos on further margins, those living overseas?
It's 12 million people. And one thing that's really fascinating about it, Mike, hi Mike, is that the 12 million Filipinos abroad do not necessarily think of themselves as Filipinos. They think of themselves as coming from a province of the Philippines. Think of Waipaho. Are the Ilocanos Filipinos or from Ilocos? So how do you deal? So the question of marginalized communities also, the question of the overseas Filipino workers, how do you bring them to the nation? You can. Yeah? They're Ilocanos foremost, they're Visayans foremost. Okay. The number of associations, provincial and regional associations globally, outnumber the Filipino associations of. You know, there is what here in Hawaii, like there's 1 or 2 Filipino associations. How many Ilocano associations? 5. So what are those associations? They're more focused on localities. So that's also one fascinating thing about overseas Filipino workers. But there is also the other side, which is you start to appreciate the nation once you're abroad. Yeah, Filipinos and Filipinos then converge in churches and say, Filipino, where you from? As against the foreigners they serve, as against the non-Filipinos they encounter. From things like, we are different from the Japanese, our hosts, or the Singaporeans, to a very funny episode of which encounter where I asked Filipino Muslim friends as to who they hang out with in the Hajj. They say, well, us Filipinos and the Southeast Asians. Why? This funny thing. Oh, the rest about the South Asian. Oh, they smell. They're not like us. This is a sort of like things like that, small, minor, seemingly peripheral, minor things like that, makes you understand that there's a fascinating area here to study, the push and pull of the sentiment of being Filipino. So Leonard is from Maui. He's not Filipino. He's Maui. Yeah, he's Ilocano family, not,
I have many more questions. I'll go to Migoy Cordero. Is the nationalist historiography in the milieu of national democracy perhaps the reason why national democracy has been consistently weak among the Moro, and the marginalization of the Moro resistance and liberation organization within the larger Moro milieu?
The Moro's anti-communism. And it's for 2 things: the inherent anti-communism is Islam, but also the connections of Philippine Islam to global Islam. If you track the movement of Islamic intellectuals outside of Manila, you've still been connected to Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Pakistan. That's the direction of their studies, the study of the intellectual development. That hasn't been studied yet.
Right.
But that's how, people move in the South. And what kind of worldview does it develop? Not Filipinos, no? But also.
So, Liloy, just a minute. He's got a question too, but I have to go to Reese Lacia. Good morning, Sir Jojo. With the current state of the Philippine Studies now, what would be a recommendable approach in interconnecting local history with the national narrative, especially with southeastern Mindanao history that also has its own narratives aside from the Muslim Mindanao? There's a growing initiative in our city to push the teaching of local history in basic education, which seems like an interesting question.
Yes, that should be welcome. The second thing is abolish the power of the Department of Education.
Or infiltrate.
And no, I can infiltrate. It's a it's a huge, horrible, creaky administrative structure that cannot be changed from inside.
That's your answer. All right, from Lisandro Claudio. Sorry it took so long. Can Maoist scholars write honest histories of the Philippines that cover anything after the founding of the CPP in 1968? Or is there no way for them to grapple with a history that includes the glories, defeats, and sins of their party?
That's what he's writing about.
That's what he's writing. But I think it's the history of the left in the Philippines is actually very rich in a way. Although it's been covered by the domination of the Communist Party, the Maoist Party. I mean, it goes back as far as the 1900s, and it also involves not just individuals in the center of power, but also in the periphery. I just finished helping edit a friend of mine's book where this young communist from the South, all alone, ex-seminarian, was all alone, moves from Manila to Saudi Arabia, to Athens, Syria, Lebanon, meets Gaddafi, goes to North Korea, goes to Vietnam, goes to Latin America, Peru, and Cuba. This kind of movement of communists is actually fascinating because it's his Maoist, but he also has his own pilgrimage or pathways that were not necessarily dictated by Maoist goals. So I think Liloy, it's all individual stories, Liloy. And I got your mother's memoirs, so it's very fascinating.
Yeah. Liloy, did we answer that question?
That's what Liloy's doing.
His mother's actually writing her history, fascinating history too.
I have one very specific question from Joseph Scalisi. Could you speak more on Constantino's avoidance of martial law in Marcos? Because in 1987, this Aquino Watch column and Demystifying Aquino, he certainly was critical of Marcos' successor. And was Constantino's silence on Marcos a product of caution or an alignment of nationalisms?
Well, 86 tracts came out in 86, and I think have never been integrated to his two textbooks. The second one is that it was more caution. I was his research assistant, and I said, do we push it here? And he said, well, we can only push that if there's a mass movement behind us. At this point in 75, anything progressive was a retreat. So the idea is how do you transcend this weakness that the dictatorship had imposed on us? And how do we overcome that and still write something progressive? Best target the Americans. Best target 50s and 60s. So the nearer his problem is, the nearer we are to dictatorship, the more he knows that Marcos would censor or would stop him from publishing. So when he presented his first outlines of his book in 75, the History Club, so I was president. The thing that he asked was, do not ask me questions, no open forum, because the students will probably ask him about Marcos. And in that particular situation, you can't afford to start ranting against Marcos. You either go to jail or he stops publishing your book. So there were tactical, in a sense, responses by people like Constantino. It was not so much the nationalism, it was just caution.
W.S. Chiang says, thank you very much for your talk. I wanted to ask, to what extent does language and translation, e.g. dynamics between regional languages, English, Filipino, etc., play a part in the kinds of historical narratives being written within the academics as well as those attempting to write from the marginal spaces? Thank you.
Okay. Well, one of the biggest ironies is that most Filipinos speak Filipino now. Even Islamic terrorists speak Filipino. And there are two things for that. There are two factors behind that. One is the nationalization of television, where everybody now speaks. The main news is in Filipino. The other is war. Most Muslim communities were forced to start learning Filipinos because they could not communicate with soldiers of the military come from the center and the north. So the next target then of this family is to let the youngest, smartest kid go to public school, learn Filipino, so that somebody could bridge the conversation, the divide between soldiers shooting at you and your community. So and then of course, the refugees, the displacement of Muslims because of the war, led to them going around, finding themselves in other parts of the Philippines, and therefore forced now to converse with the communities in Filipino, who were also forced to take Filipino. I mean, were required to take Filipino and Visayan, but you eventually have to do that. But this interesting thing that I noticed when we were in Tawi-Tawi is how easily people switch if you know that you tell them you're not speaking Filipino. I see that more in the margins than in the cities.
You mean like if you say, I'm going to speak Visayan?
I'm going to speak Visayan, I'm going to speak Bahasa. Speak Bahasa. As if it wasn't. And so that what's happening then is while Filipino is homogenized, most of the country, there are still continuous resistance by, in a sense, resistance by communities in preserving their language. But I think it's a losing battle because we have no, we have no dictionaries. Hopefully that will be countered soon. You notice that, no? In Tawi-Tawi, some of these people we met, they suddenly, oh, I'll speak Bahasa now, Well, I'll speak Chinese now. Like, okay. And so the ease with which they do that, that's one of the powers of the margin.
Right. I think that's it for the questions we have online. If anyone else, just a minute, does anyone else have any questions here? Yes, Barbara does.
Well, thank you very much. I really enjoyed that as a historian. But, I'm thinking back over the 7 decades or so since the war, and when you think about all the countries in Southeast Asia, the state, even though you might want to get rid of it now, but it was very fragile, very fragile. So you can understand why national history was preeminent. I remember very well talking to one of the most eminent Indonesian historians who said, we can't have all these local voices, we have to keep together. And when Yugoslavia fell, Indonesians were really shocked. Because they thought if people with white skin and long noses, if they can't keep their countries together, what hope is there for us? So I think there has to be, there's a rationale behind. It's not just the dying of the left. There was those people who support a kind of a national viewpoint. They may want to include more voices, but they've got this other goal too of keeping everybody together. And once you start writing from the bottom, that can cause difficulties. So do you think that's a real, quite apart from political affiliation, that's a real issue for historiography if you want to write books that reflect reality but accomplish that goal of still supporting what is often a very fragile sense of nation?
I can't answer that.
Because he's an anarchist.
Yeah, the problem with this thing I'm interested in, I almost end up with saying, well, we should have separated from the Philippines.
Yeah.
It's always, logically, just logical, look at the base of the data. It's always the marginalized community, a marginalized party because of the center. And it's not just economic, political, it's also intellectual, cultural. So you also realize that the nation cannot break up because if it breaks up like Yugoslavia, where will the Filipinos go? California or Hawaii? But I think for me, the positive thing about the tension is you will always have a national history that's constantly becomes increasingly sensitive to local demands. And also people probably in the localities, not me, saying, okay, can you include our stories, please? And when including that, figure this in. And that hasn't happened yet. I think it's probably happening now with all these local history conferences that Vina mentioned. But I like the tension. And I think probably in the case of the Philippines, that will continue for us for a while, especially since the state is weak and political power is held by local warlords and political families, who, if you would think of them as culturally sensitive, also would like to have a legacy that is extremely local. One of the fascinating things that's happened in the last 10 years is actually some of these warlords actually hosting, providing, paying for the construction of museums. Basically saying, sir, can you just set aside 2% of your the things you stole and build this museum? So in the Philippines, if you go around, there are actually these museums that's donated by with the gracious foundation of Congressman so and so. But the fascinating thing is that people really bring back. These guys really think of themselves. So can warlords become art patrons? Yes, I think so. But I think that for me, it's the beauty of the tension that goes on, because if one side is just privileged, the other side not given a chance to speak, they will dominate. If the other side is given all this right to talk about their local histories, independent of national histories, it will also put pressure on. It also unravel the nation. So I think along the more regional histories are there, the more stories of localities are there, the more works are written not only in English or Filipino, but also the other languages. I think the more possibility, this is the possibility of eventually, not in my lifetime, something that would put the two together, fuse the two together, would appear, and a national history, as it were, of the country would emerge. But not in my time, I think.
But what will it take to get away from apologist interpretations of Marcos?
More data on Marcos, more research on Marcos.
And maybe these local histories will offset the emphasis.
I mean, there's no history of the massacres perpetrated by the Marcos dictatorship in Mindanao. Only now do you see evidence of it in films and documentaries, but no one has written that.
And that's what you say should be coming out in the
Right,
next 10 to 20 years.
if you look at them, what weakened the Marcos dictatorship it was in 1986. It was in 75 when 100 Muslim cadres trained in Libya decided to start a war against the army. Nobody writes about them. Yeah.
It's your own textbook, Joe. Do you think your own textbook is sort of a corrective to the textbooks that you were right? I mean, isn't it that one that you wrote that it really to it's a kind of like to I mean I agree that I think we should just, and as Lelo said in the introduction or forward, that this whole textbook should be history and not impart history, right? In that sense, and I think that's the reason why I mean that's why your book, your own textbook, right? And I think the problem is we don't have a lot of people writing new textbooks or like that, and I think yours was a kind of corrective to that. But what do you think? Like it did not. You feel like it wasn't gone into the mainstream, or
no? We had lesser ambitions on that. We wrote a textbook which we thought we hope our nieces in the U.S. and our nephews and nieces in the Philippines could read. That's it. Is there a textbook that you can write that both our nephews in the U.S. and the Philippines can use?
Has it been translated into Filipino?
No, not even translated.
No.
So I think it worked.
Yeah. I was going to just say that one of the things we use your textbook in our class, and one of the things that's valuable is it's not purely on the Philippines. You've incorporated the area.
Yeah.
And that was what made it so much more useful. Because, you read Philippine history, and it's just Philippines. Everybody else is cut off.
Yeah. Well, the high point really is a comment from a student that says, I have a pea-brained mind and I always fail my political science. Thank you for this book. I passed my exam, my courses. So I think that's an American student.
I have one last question again from Migoy Cordero. Is it all right if we finish with this? We're good? All right. What is interesting about Philippine anarchist historiography, for example, Bas Umali,
I don't know,
is the rejection of the nation state while still centering the boundaries of the Philippine archipelago within the historiography and claiming a sort of false indigeneity. What do you think an anarchist or anti-nationalist or internationalist Philippine studies that really does displace the insularity of Philippine studies looks like?
Wow. I don't know.
Sorry, Migoy.
I don't know. I mean, I'm just starting. Yeah, sorry. I have ideas, but I'm not confident enough to point them out. Apologies.
Well, so that's what you could do in your retirement, I suppose. Develop it. Well, thank you very much, everyone, for participating. And thank you, Jojo. On behalf of the Center for Southeast Asian Studies, we'd also like to thank our online participants. And we're sorry you can't join us for a reception we're about to go to. Thank you.
Thank you.
Now you can blast it.